Hello, I am speaking on behalf of Winter in Baseball, my baseball blog. Going to continue talking about my baseball memories. And it's been a little bit since I've done this, but I was going to go through the year 2001 through 2004. But before I do that, if you're really interested in anything like this, right now I am writing a blog about baseball, but the biggest thing I'm focusing on right now is baseball cards. So I'm basically trying to examine and write about every single baseball card that I have. I just finished the Arizona Diamondbacks, at least in the binders that I have out right now. I might have some more cards scattered, but I just finished the Arizona Diamondbacks and I have written a post about every single card, kind of analyzing the card, giving my memories on each player, if I remember the player, if I don't remember the player, trying to see what I can find as far as statistically what type of player they were, and just kind of give my reaction to that kind of thing. I also have some plans with this YouTube channel to maybe I want to do like some sort of like more live reactions to baseball events as they occur, but considering it's almost February, there's not really a lot of baseball going on right now, although pitchers and catchers will be reporting somewhat soon. But in the future, I do want to write or I want to do an out of the park baseball series, but not like the other one that I'm kind of working on where I was doing individual games, which not completely sure how much I'm going to continue to do that, but I want to do some what if scenarios and just kind of simulate them and let the game kind of play out some what if scenarios I have in my head. The main ones I have right now that I was going to be doing is Mark Pryor and Kerry Wood. So what if they stayed healthy? Essentially, what I'm going to do is insert Mark Pryor into the 2002 season and simulate through however long their career would last, like a normal healthy career. And if there's any injuries, I'm going to take over as commissioner mode and just turn them off and just play out their career differently with the Cubs and kind of see how the Cubs would have been if Mark Pryor and Kerry Wood had stayed healthy, like we all hope they would, like they're in their 2003 season when the team came very, very close to making the World Series. But this is going to be about this is going to continue my baseball memories, my baseball biography, if you will. And in this one, I'm going to talk about the years 2001 through 2004. And so to mark that occasion, I am wearing a 1969 Seattle Pilots hat for no real reason whatsoever. I just like the hat, but this team existed about 30 years before the seasons I'm going to talk about. But the reason why I'm pretty excited to talk about the 2001 to 2004 seasons because I think this is the most impactful seasons on myself as a baseball fan, a baseball person. These are the seasons where I was playing baseball in high school. Granted, I wasn't very good, but I was doing that. I would come home from our games, at least in the early days of high school, come home from our games and come home, watch baseball tonight, get a recap on what the seasons on what had happened in the day, watch the web gyms, watch highlights, and go to bed or go to my bedroom, listen to sports talk radio where they talk more and more about baseball and what was going on in the league. And I was just completely drinking it all in the ways that you could in 2001. I went on sports message boards. I was constantly on the internet researching baseball. Obviously, like social media didn't really exist then, but you still had like chat rooms. Not even chat rooms really at this point. It was mostly sports message boards, like ESPN message boards, and then I know there's some private message boards that I would go on later on where you would just completely engulf yourself in the game or immerse yourself in the game, and it was just it's what meant the most to me, like especially in those high school years because I was not quite an adult. I didn't have those responsibilities as of yet. I also spent a lot of time playing baseball video games like MLB The Show, or not MLB The Show, but MVP Baseball came out. I was really, really into MLB or MVP Baseball 2004. I know MVP Baseball 2005 is the big game that everybody talks about, but MVP 2004 is the one that I played the most because I had PC, I had it on computer. And I know MVP 2004 had a glitch where left-handers could barely hit home runs. There was like an issue where they zapped their power, but I had a patch that fixed that, so I didn't have that issue whatsoever. So I played a lot of MVP 2004. I actually played MVP 2003 as well on the computer, but the game was kind of a prototype. I don't think they had franchise mode, or at least like the full capabilities of franchise mode. They didn't have minor leagues. It was very much rebranding from the Triple Play series from the late 2000s that I also played a lot as a kid. The other baseball series that I really, or not even series, but one game, it was High Heat, and I want to say it was 2002, 2001. It had Vladimir Guerrero on the cover, and I played that game like crazy as well. I think I liked the statistical layout that they had in the game. It was very spreadsheet-like, and it seemed like they had a lot more stats than I'd ever seen in a baseball game. And it was very clearly made for the computer, whereas like MVP baseball and stuff was more made for console. That was just kind of ported onto a computer. And while looking back on it, the graphics weren't great, and there were definitely some bugs that I did download some patches to fix. That game was very, very memorable to me. I really, really enjoyed playing that baseball game, and I spent, I would say, I think it was the summer of 2001, just the entirety of that summer playing that baseball game. I remember taking the Cubs all the way to the World Series. They lost to the Boston Red Sox in that universe, which is kind of ironic because I live out in Boston now. And then I think MVP 2004, I think I did the same thing. I think I got to the World Series and lost to the Boston Red Sox. I never actually won the World Series. MVP 2004, I actually played an entire season and then got about halfway through the second season before I finally burned out and quit playing the game. But had a lot of fun playing those baseball games, just immersing myself in my own baseball universes. I like to create my own players, like create my own overpowered player, throw them on a baseball team, that sort of thing. And then as far as the baseball season itself, the 2001 Chicago Cubs, I look back on as one of my favorite ever baseball teams because this was the first team where they led. So the 2001 Cubs weren't really expected to be any good. In 1999 and 2000 they were really, really bad. And 2001 there wasn't a lot of expectations of them being very good, but they got off to a really, really good start. And I remember about halfway through the season they had like a 7-8 game lead. Sports talk radio hosts started to be very, very adamant that they were going to win the division. Like they seemed like they were going to cruise to the division title, even though the St. Louis Cardinals and the Houston Astros were also really, really good in 2001. 2001, I really, really just every single day I wanted to watch that team play. Like whether it was night, like if they were playing a night game, I had to watch the night game. If it was a day game, like just it was set aside appointment television for me to watch the 2001 Chicago Cubs. Sammy Sosa had a great season that year. Another year hitting 60 plus home runs. He might have won the MVP. He was definitely an MVP candidate. I think it was his best season of his career, even though he hit more home runs in 1998. 2001, he was better all around hitter and basically carried the Cubs team to getting really, really close to division title. I remember other moments of that season, like when the Cubs got Fred McGriff, there was a lot of rumors. Like the Cubs, they were not used to being buyers at the trade deadline, and everyone's like, okay, they got to push for it so they can get to the World Series. Like this has got to be the year they're going to get to the World Series. And they almost seemed like, well, Fred McGriff was actually, I believe he had a no trade clause when he was at the Tampa Bay Rays or the Devil Rays at the time, and there was a lot of rumors that their Cubs were going to get him. They needed a first baseman. I think the first baseman that year they were using like Ron Coomer, Matt Stairs, Julio Zaletta would come up and play. Just not a very deep first base position. And Fred McGriff was available on this bad team, and obviously Fred McGriff ultimately goes to the Hall of Fame. The Cubs finally swing the trade for Fred McGriff. It seemed up in the air for a while. People weren't sure if he's going to waive his no trade clause. It seemed like he wasn't for a little bit because he was at the end of his career. I think he was happy in Tampa Bay. Not necessarily. I don't think he necessarily cared about wins and losses at the time. Maybe he did. It just seemed like there was bigger things going on in his life than just winning baseball games on the field. I mean, he played for the Atlanta Braves early in his career. He'd been around. Like he'd done a lot of things. He was a great baseball player. And he ultimately does get traded to the Cubs. It was super exciting, and we thought that that was going to be the trade that pushed them over the hump and got them to the playoffs. Now, in 2001, they didn't. They ended up losing and kind of collapsing late in September. I don't know if they even, I don't even like to call it a collapse. I think the team kind of just regressed to the mean. I think they finally just weren't good. Like they weren't good enough to win that division. They never really were. They were kind of overplaying the whole entire season, and eventually just the season caught up to them, and they ended up losing the division. But 2001, very, very memorable baseball season, not just for that. Obviously, 9/11 happened in 2001, and I remember 9/11 very distinctly. I mean, who doesn't? But as far as like baseball related, I actually was staying home sick. I had the stomach flu right around, it was the day or two before 9/11. I was home when 9/11 happened, and I remember just laying on my bed, listening to sports talk radio, obviously getting excited for the Cubs. And I think I listened to, it was one of the nights before 9/11 happened. The Cubs were playing a night game. I had my radio. I was sitting on my bed. I had a water bed, and I was listening to the Cubs play I think it was the Cincinnati Reds, and they lost. And I think it was the beginning of their collapse of the season. But then 9/11 happened, and the season took I think it was 7 or 8 day break, something like that. And it kind of just didn't matter anymore. The baseball season kind of just stopped mattering for quite some time until once it kind of got going. I remember the first game the Cubs got back. I wasn't super excited for it because the whole aspect of what 9/11 happened, like it was such a weird culture shock where like just entertainment aspects didn't really matter anymore. And so to get right back into I care about baseball, this season matters was a lot. And then the fact that the Cubs were kind of struggling and kind of on a downward spiral anyways. I do remember that first night back. I don't even remember if I watched the game, but I remember the highlights so vividly of Sammy Sosa running out to right field carrying the flag, and then he hit a home run, and he definitely carried a flag around the base. I can't remember if he carried a flag on the right field, but I remember all the Wrigley bleachers were holding the flags up, and it was a very patriotic scene, and it was definitely like an emotional moment. And then yeah, when Sammy Sosa hit a home run, he had a little American flag that he carried as he ran around the bases, and it was a pretty cool thing. I do believe the Cubs actually ended up losing the game, and like I said, they had a downward spiral to kind of collapse and end the season. But 2001, it wasn't just the Cubs. Like there was so much going on in baseball that was super super memorable in that season. The Seattle Mariners won 116 games, and I remember early in that season, just every single day I would check the newspaper, and it just seemed like the Mariners would win and not lose. You would kind of keep track of the standings, and they started to look absurd at one point. I feels like it was like they were like 36-6 or 40-6. I don't remember the exact breakdown, but I just remember every single day you check the newspaper and see the standings, and then you would look at the how many games they were ahead, and they were just building this insurmountable lead early on. And the team that was behind them was actually the Moneyball Oakland A's, I believe. Or that might have been 2002. 2002 might have been the Moneyball team, but the 2001 Oakland A's were really, really good, and I think they won over 100 games. But they were so like the Mariners won so many games that it didn't really matter. The race was over from the get-go. It was all about the entire season of can the Mariners pass the 1908 Cubs record or the 1906 Cubs record of 116 wins? Can they break the American League record? Can they break all these records with wins? And that was the season. And then you had the insane Sunday night baseball game between the Mariners and the Indians, where the Mariners led by 12 runs, and the Indians came all the way back and won the game. And I watched most of that game live. I think I just turned it on with something to do, and I had to have been when the Indians started their comeback because I don't know why I would have just sat down and watched this game, except for it was Sunday night and I had nothing else to do, and I wanted to watch Sunday night baseball. Maybe that might have been what it was. I might have just was ready for the game to end so I could watch Sunday night baseball. But then the Indians come all the way back. They win the game. It was one of the craziest regular season games ever, and it's actually the game that keeps the Mariners from winning 117 games, which would have been the major league record, and would have been even stranger because they didn't even win the World Series. They went on to lose the World Series or the American League Championship Series to the Yankees. But you had that going on. You had the Arizona Diamondbacks with Randy Johnson, Kurt Schilling, this crazy, like really good pitching staff, and they were doing their thing. The Yankees were really, really good, and Ichiro was in his first season, just put into the Hall of Fame. And I have a video about my thoughts on Hall of Famers, the recently inducted Hall of Famers, if you wanted to watch that. But Ichiro, his rookie season with the Seattle Mariners, so he's out there being Ichiro and getting hits and kind of bringing Japan into the American game even more so. I know Hideo Nomo kind of brought the Japanese fans into the game quite a bit, and then obviously Japanese baseball is huge, and just a lot going on in the 2001 season. And then my favorite Cubs game, of one of my favorite regular season Cubs games of all time, happened as well. This is the game when I first got introduced to Angel Hernandez, and This is also the game where Steve McMichael threatened to fight Angel Hernandez, former NFL football player Steve McMichael, former professional wrestler Steve McMichael, was drunk in the booth during the seventh inning stretch, and he threatened to beat up Angel Hernandez after what seemed to be a bad call at the plate pretty late in the season. And the entire game was crazy. So that moment was crazy. That game I watched in its entirety, and it was getting to be late season Cubs baseball. Like they needed to get some wins to put some distance between them and second place in the division. It might have been the Astros or Cardinals. I can't remember which one. I know they were both kind of there, and they were kind of at the time they were the big teams in the division. But the Cubs were playing the Rockies, and Angel Hernandez was behind the plate, and I think he has a reputation for someone who just doesn't call a good game behind the plate. Like balls and strikes, most people think Angel Hernandez is not great at it. And in this game, I remember very vividly there was balls that were way up in the zone being called strikes, balls that were way down in the zone. The strike zone was off. And at the time, I didn't know who Angel Hernandez was, but after this game, I very much did so. And I remember Steve Stone in the booth was ripping on Angel Hernandez. So he definitely had this reputation for not being people enjoyed in 2001. And it was building throughout the whole game. People were getting really really upset in the crowd about the strike zone. It was a night game at Wrigley. And night games at Wrigley, especially back then, when the team was good. Like the Cubs teams aren't very good often. It's late in the season. It's a night game at Wrigley. There's a lot of alcohol starting to get involved. People are passionate. People want to see the team win, and you could just feel the tension in the crowd the whole night. Like it just had this like very angry atmosphere. The Cubs were struggling with the Rockies. I don't remember if the Rockies were good or not in 2001. It didn't feel like they were at the very least. I don't think they were in any sort of playoff race, and it just felt like a lot of desperation in the stands, and there was these bad calls going against them, and the Cubs were losing most of the game, if I remember right. And the call that set Steve McMichael off was, I think, a wild pitch at the plate, and lots of people thought he was safe. The catcher made the tag. The umpire, Angel Hernandez, called him out. And back then, we didn't have instant replay, so if the umpire made a call, that was it. The call is what it was. Looking back on it, and I think I've watched the highlight, I actually do think he was out at the plate. I think that call itself was not a bad call, but the entire buildup of the game with the bat, and you don't like really see this in the highlights because you're not really watching the entire game, and I don't think I can find the entire game on YouTube or anything, which is kind of disappointing. I'd like to rewatch this game because it's a crazy regular season baseball game, and but the tension in the crowd, it didn't matter. It didn't matter if that call was technically right. It was close, but everybody was so mad. Everybody was so ticked off, and it was late in the game, and that was such a big moment in the game. People were just angry, and it was right before the seventh inning stretch. Um, well, it came up soon because the Rockies had to bat first in the top of the seventh. So this would have been the bottom of the sixth. The top of the seventh happens. The Rockies, I don't think they did anything. They might have scored and taken a lead. Maybe that made people more angry. I don't remember the exact sequence of events, except for the seventh inning stretch happens. Steve McMichael sings it. He starts blowing kisses at Angel Hernandez. He tells Angel Hernandez, I want to have speaks with the umpire after the game. It's a whole crazy thing. The thing ends with Steve McMichael staring up at the booth, like, or not McMichael, but Angel Hernandez staring up at the booth with his scowl, just angry, very, very angry. But you're also like, what is Angel Hernandez going to do to Steve McMichael, especially drunk and belligerent Steve McMichael? They go to commercial with everybody just like ravaged. Like everyone's like, the fans are just completely, it almost feels like a riot's about to break out. And they go to commercial and they come back and they talk about Chip Carey and Steve Stone. Chip Carey was the play-by-play announcer. And back then they used to, I guess they do still nowadays, but when the seventh inning stretch conductor would sing, he would then be interviewed in the booth. But in this case, they told us that Steve McMichael was escorted out of the booth because he was ejected from the ball game. So there was no interview with Steve McMichael, which was weird to begin with. And then Chip Carey starts, and you don't see these highlights don't really exist anymore. This is part of the reason why I would love to rewatch this game. So if anybody has this game on tape or anything, please upload it because I would love to rewatch this game. But Chip Carey starts talking about how classless that was and how he was drunk and unacceptable it was. And I remember Steve Stone making some comment about, oh, you wouldn't say it to his face. You didn't say any of this while he was here, which was just kind of funny because Chip Carey does kind of have this reputation for being kind of a dork, and Steve Stone definitely has a reputation for making these snide, sarcastic comments. And it was such a Steve Stone Chip Carey exchange. It was weird. It was very bizarre that it happened at that moment. And actually now I'm kind of wondering if it was Steve Stone because for most of the season it was Dave Otto and Joe Carter were actually the color commentators because I think Steve Stone was gone sick, but it's possible he came back because I swear it was Steve Stone and Chip Carey who had this exchange, but I actually could be completely misremembering it. And maybe it was one of the other, maybe it was Joe Carter or somebody who made the snide comment, but it sounds more like a Steve Stone sort of thing. I really do want to revisit it because it was such a crazy thing that all you see when the highlights happens is always just the Steve McMichael seventh inning stretch and him getting ejected, or not. I don't even think you see him getting ejected. You just see Angel Hernandez staring up at the booth, anger. And there was so much more that happened to that game that was crazy. But then the game itself, the Cubs ended up do end up tying the game, and they get to the bottom of the ninth inning. I think it was the ninth inning. It might have went extras, but I'm pretty sure this was in the bottom of the ninth. Ricky Gutierrez gets on second base, and there's a base hit. I think Joe Girardi singles to right field. It looks like the Cubs are going to win the game. They come back. They're going to win the game. This electric Wrigley crowd, pretty much a playoff game, but with like a lot more vigor. People were more angry for this than I think what you see at the, except for the Steve Bartman game when people look like they're ready to kill him, which is completely messed up. But people were more electric, I think, for this game than I've seen for a lot of playoff games. And Joe Girardi gets a base hit. Ricky Gutierrez rounds the base. It looks like he's going to score. Wrigley's absolutely going crazy. And Ricky Gutierrez trips over third base and has to run back to third, but he's in a rundown. So what happens is he's in this rundown going back and forth. I think he actually might have made his way back to third base safely because the Rockies decide not to make a play on him. They end up going to first. So I think Gutierrez, the exact breakdown I can't specifically remember, but there's a rundown at third base. He ends up going to third safely, so the Rockies stop paying attention to him. They throw to first, and the rundown happens between first and second. I think this is what happened. I think Gutierrez rounds third. He falls over. He gets back to third, okay, but the runner on first base kept going, which I think was Girardi, and he gets in a rundown, and they're going back and forth. So while this is happening, Ricky Gutierrez is on third base, and he beelines it for home plate. And I believe Todd Helton was the first baseman. He turns around, throws. Ricky Gutierrez slides under the tag. He's safe. Wrigley goes absolutely bananas. Top five, maybe top 10, probably one of my favorite, maybe my favorite regular season Cubs game of all time. And to be honest, it beat a lot of playoff Cubs games, even some of the wins, just because it was so crazy and so electric and so just bananas. And I remember that night just wanting to post on the message boards. I remember wanting to watch the highlights. I just wanted to see this over and over again because it was such a crazy baseball game. So that was the 2001 season, and then that ends up going to the World Series or going to the World Series of that year in 2001 was the Arizona Diamondbacks and the New York Yankees, which obviously happens after 9/11. It's the first World Series to go into November, and it's weird because my whole life I rooted for the New York Yankees, but I also always had a fondness for expansion teams. So because of that, I started, and also like other people I knew also hated the Yankees. I started to kind of go along with that more and more and became not a Yankee fan. And so the first season that I didn't root for the Yankees was 2001. So the first time I rooted against the Yankees was after 9/11, the New York team after 9/11, which is a little weird, but that's what ended up happening. So I rooted for the Arizona Diamondbacks in the series, and I was rooting really, really hard. And the World Series itself was an absolute classic. I think it's the greatest World Series of all time. When you think of 9/11 happening and the events like how this is the first big event post 9/11 that we had, and you consider those atmospheres, you consider all the emotions of New York, you consider the two games late in the where the Yankees tie the game late off Byung Kim with home runs and dramatic, like so much drama. And then you go to Game 7 of the World Series where the Diamondbacks are down against Mariano Rivera, who may be the best closer of all time. the only unanimous Hall of Famer, and Luis Gonzalez fists a hit into right field, and Arizona Diamondbacks walk it off and they win the World Series. So one of the greatest World Series of all time. I'm sorry if things are getting crazy. My cats are fighting over there, so they don't have much interest in the 2001 World Series, I guess, which is a little disappointing. But the 2001 season, very, very just great baseball season. Move forward to 2002. 2002, the Chicago Cubs were not a very good baseball team. Um, they kind of went back to what they were supposed to be. In 2001, there's not much else to say. That just, the 2002 Chicago Cubs were really really bad, and the only real memorable thing of that season was Mark Pryor making his debut because they did draft him. I think they drafted him the year before because the 2000 season they were really really bad. Mark Pryor was drafted second after Joe Mauer. Joe Mauer was only selected because he was, if I remember right, now I could be getting the narratives wrong, but I remember Joe Mauer was only selected because he was a native Minnesotan and he was considered to be cheaper than Mark Pryor, cheaper to sign. So everyone was pretty convinced that if any other team had been number one, Mark Pryor would have gone number one, but he instead goes to the Chicago Cubs. I could even have their orders reversed. Joe Meyer might have gone number two and Pryor number one. I don't remember the specifics of it, but I do remember that was kind of the debate at the time was Joe Mauer or Mark Pryor. And realistically, obviously Joe Mauer was the ultimate decision who made the most sense, but Mark Pryor, if he had stayed healthy, his pitch, I mean, he was an incredible pitcher. I mean, his first year in the majors where he was healthy was his 2003 season where he was a very, very good pitcher. So I don't think it was necessarily a bad choice. It's just unfortunately the health happened and Mark Pryor just didn't stay healthy. But Mark Pryor was very, 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 very good in I mean, very, very good in 2003. But 2002 was the year he was drafted, and while the Cubs were really, really bad, I do remember the night that Mark Pryor made his debut. He debuted against the Pittsburgh Pirates. I actually listened to it on the radio because I think I was probably playing high heat baseball, like I was just talking about. So I listened to it on the radio, but you could hear the crowd through the radio, and it was an electric night at Wrigley. Even though the team was ultimately not very good, the Cubs ended up winning the game. There was just so much excitement as this young pitching phenom took the mound, and it just seemed like we were on the way. Like, yeah, this team wasn't very, very good, but you could kind of see the future with Kerry Wood and Mark Pryor and what they could build around that pitching staff. It was just something that the Cubs never really had before because it wasn't like a team known for building their pitching staff or building their farm system. And now they had Kerry Wood, they have Mark Pryor, and it just seemed like the future was all bright. And that segues, and then in the 2002 season, not much else really, really sticks out to me as far as that season goes, although I think I do remember the passing of Darryl Kyle. I think that did happen that year. And that was obviously incredibly sad when he tragically died before a Cubs Cardinals game on Sunday Night Baseball, or at least they announced it. Then I remember Joe Girardi coming out and announcing in the crowd that there's been a tragedy in the Cardinals family, and nothing else was announced, and it was just obviously a terrible, terrible thing. And then that World Series would have been the Giants and the Angels, and I rooted for the Angels that year. I wanted to see just kind of some new blood, get a World Series ring, and I liked the Rally Monkey a lot. That was kind of a fun thing that happened in 2002. The World Series itself, it was a pretty good World Series, especially Game 6 where the Angels came back from 5, 6 runs down to ultimately keep the Giants from clinching, and they won the World Series. Barry Bonds, obviously really, really good in 2002. Obviously a big force for the Giants team. Um, But yeah, other than that, I think mostly like when the Cubs are not a very, very good team, it's hard for me to completely engulf myself in baseball, but there was definitely certainly some memories associated with that. And oh yeah, I didn't even mention that in 2001. For some reason, I actually thought it was in 2002. I was just looking up Barry Bonds. I couldn't remember what year he hit 73 home runs. Barry Bonds also did that in 2001. So you have those major events. You had 9/11. You have the Seattle Mariners' amazing season. You have one of the greatest World Series of all time. You have my personal investment in the Chicago Cubs. And at the end of the day, the 2001 season is one of the greatest, most memorable seasons ever. I think that was also the same year Cal Ripken Jr. played his last I think it might have been his last season, but he was in his last All-Star game and he hit a home run that a lot of people think was served up to him, but I mean at the end of the day if it was, A, it's the All-Star game, and B, you still got to hit the ball out and he did it. So a lot of memorable things. Ichiro making his debut. Like I said, so many amazing things happened in that 2001 season. The 2002 season, it was just tough to follow that up with anything. Uh, Nothing as major as that, but the 2002 World Series with the Angels winning it was a pretty good story. It's the last time the Angels won the World Series. It's the only time they won the World Series. And then that segues into 2003. So the 2003 Cubs are one of the more infamous Cubs teams in the history of the game. And obviously their season ended in the most heartbreaking way. I still think of game 6 of the 2003 NLCS and just wonder what if. Obviously that was the Steve Bartman game. But the entire season itself was a lot of fun, except for like the Cubs never really. This is the one thing about the Cubs season in 2003 that I don't think is remembered very much. The Cubs were only like an 88, 89 win team. The NL Central wasn't an elite division. They weren't. The Cubs were not an elite team. So for most of 2003, and you got to remember they're coming from 2002 and 2003. Also, you have Pryor and Wood kind of growing, but I don't think anybody thought they were ready to take that final step and be that World Series contender. So the 2003 team was like a lot of excitement. It's kind of like the 2015 Cubs, where you're like, here come the young kids, here they come, they're starting to be good, but it's a little too early. And the 2003 team kind of had that vibe and that feeling to it. But the team just kind of hung around. They kept playing really solid baseball. I remember Houston was the team they were chasing for most of the year. The Cardinals were there too because they had a huge like 5 game series late in the season that ended up being a big decider and kind of eliminated the Cardinals. The Cubs won 4 out of 5 games in the 5 game series. There's a book about it. I think it was 5 Nights in October or something along those lines. But that was obviously a big moment in that season. But the Cubs were just kind of hanging in there. And I remember the trade deadline deal where they got Aramis Ramirez, who's one of my all-time favorite Cubs players, Randall Simon, Kenny Lofton, who's just one of the coolest players in baseball history, played for a couple months with the Chicago Cubs. And that trade didn't feel at the time like it was an amazing trade. Like it wasn't like these are huge names. It ended up being, well, Randall Simon was signed separately. I always forget that he actually was signed separately or traded for separately. But the Ramos Ramirez, Kenny Lofton deal from the Padres, the Pirates, I mean, I'm sorry, was such ultimately a major catalyst to the second half of the Cubs season when they end up overtaking Houston, they ended up overtaking St. Louis, and the last day of the season they actually played the Pittsburgh Pirates. I still remember the ground ball double play to win the division. Ron Santos screaming into the microphone. Cubs going to the playoffs. Pat Hughes going goodbye Houston, hello Atlanta, because that's who they played in the first round of the playoffs. And this team just started to have a vibe because like they went for it. They made a trade that seemed at the time underwhelming, but it was actually kind of came across as a shrewd trade. And they got the young player, and he was injecting himself in the lineup. The team looked really, really good. They had the young kids going, Kerry Wood, Mark Pryor, but they had other players like Carlos Zambrano also he kind of came out of nowhere. It was another good pitcher on the staff. Matt Clement was another player they acquired in the trade, and it was just starting to look like something special was brewing. They ended up playing the Atlanta Braves. They win the very first game of the series and get off to a great start. And it just starts to look like they end up losing game 2, but it starts to look like, okay, we're going back to Wrigley. We got our aces going. We're going to win the series. They end up winning game 3 of the series. Mark Pryor pitches an absolute gem. I believe it's a complete game shutout. Some people think it's the reason that he ended up blowing game 7 against the constant use. And Pryor ended up pitching over 200 innings at that season at the age of 22, which is a little crazy that a 22-year-old's throwing that many pitches, but I understand it was the time period, but I do feel like at the time there was a lot more focus on not. There was still like pitch counts mattered for like young pitchers. I do feel like that was a thing then, but I don't know. Maybe it wasn't to the extreme that I remember it, but it looking back on it, seeing Mark Pryor pitch over 200 years or 200 innings at 22 years old is a little crazy. And then obviously you add the playoffs, but he pitches an absolute gem in Game 3. I actually went to Game 4 of that series. It's the first playoff game I ever went to, and I've only gone to two. And I remember being at Wrigley Field on the day the Cubs could potentially clinch their first playoff series since 1908. They they ended up losing the game, but it was pretty crazy just sitting. I sat in the upper deck a couple rows from the overhang, so it was like a couple rows, like maybe a row two or three of the upper deck down the first baseline. And getting late in the game, although the Cubs were losing, the entire police force of Chicago, it probably wasn't, but it seemed like the entire police force of Chicago, you could see them all from the all in the outfield, like beyond the outfield bleachers, and this kind of surrounding the fences. And it was getting to a point where I'm sitting there like, what happens if they win? If they win this game, are we going to be like leaving through a riot? Like, what are we going to be leaving through? Because it was kind of surreal just watching everything starting to surround Wrigley Field. And then the ninth inning comes. The Cubs are facing John Smoltz is on the mound as the closer, and the Cubs are down 2 to 3 runs. So it doesn't look like they're going to win the game. It looks like the Braves are going to take this one. But the Cubs start to rally. Damian Miller hits a double with nobody out, and Wrigley goes insane. Like he just tied the game, and I was like, dude, like it was a double to lead off the inning. Like we're still very much out of it, but Wrigley goes crazy, and they start. You could tell like it was a different vibe. Usually Wrigley like during these games felt like this tension, like they were gonna blow it, they're gonna mess it up, but this time they were rallying around their team, and you can really feel it. And Damian Miller hits the double. It eventually gets to a point where Sammy Sosa's up with 2 outs, and I believe he's the winning run at the plate. At the very least, he's the tying run. And John Smoltz hits one, and Sosa just misses it. Like he hits a high fly ball. Like for a split second, you're there. You're like, and I know Wrigley has this like reputation for overreacting to fly balls, but like off the bat for like a split second, I was like, this thing might go. Like holy cow, I might be like watching the most iconic moment in Cubs history. And he flies out short, and the game's over. And unfortunately, didn't get to see that insane moment. The series actually goes back to Wrigley, or go back to Atlanta, where Kerry Wood is pitching for the uh, the deciding game, the game five. So obviously I was nervous. When we left Wrigley Field, nothing but positivity, nothing but positivity. Everybody's chanting "Carey, Carey" as you're walking out of the stadium. Like everybody is at 100% belief that the Cubs are winning Game 5 because we have Kerry Wood on the mound, and that's what they did. They went to Atlanta, they won Game 5. Everybody went absolutely crazy, and the Cubs win their first playoff series since 1908, which is pretty nuts. Like 95 years between playoff series. Would have been really cool if I got to see it live. Unfortunately, I didn't. But regardless, they go on to win that series, and they go on to face ultimately the Florida Marlins. And what I'm going to do, because that is such a iconic moment in me learning what pain is as a Cubs fan, in this video, I feel like to do the 03 and 04 seasons, I thought I was going to do just 01 through 04 in this one video. What I'm actually going to do, I'm going to cut it off here and talk about the 03 and 04 seasons later. I might go on beyond to that just because I want to really hammer home the 2003 Marlins series and how that affected me. And then it segues into the 2004 season, which ultimately kind of segues into 05 and 06, where the Cubs kind of take this complete downward turn and they're really bad. And then the 07 and 08 to me kind of feel like a completely different generation of Cubs teams. So I want to kind of capture that. So what I'm going to do is stop this video right here with the celebration of the 2003 Cubs winning their first ever playoff series against the Atlanta Braves and how great that felt going into. And actually let me backtrack there. The Marlins beat the Giants earlier that day, and I remember being at Wrigley Field, and they put that score on the center field scoreboard, and Wrigley went absolutely crazy because we were convinced. I personally did not. I not going to celebrate. It's baseball. Matchups don't matter as much as you think. Like in terms of like upsets and stuff, anything can happen. But Wrigley went absolutely crazy, and I remember thinking like this is bad. Like don't be doing that. But everybody was crazy because the Giants were considered to be the best team in the National League, and the Marlins upset them. So with that, if the Cubs won the series, they now go on to play the Marlins, where they would be favorite. They would home field advantage, and seem like they were going to go to their first ever World Series since 1945. Obviously, that's not what happened, but that's where I'm going to end this now. If you have any other thoughts about this season, if there's anything that I left out you would like me to speak about, please do comment below. Drop a like, that would be great. Other than that, I want to thank you for watching this, and you have a great day.